Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about our favorite Persian enemy, Iran. The Iranians have gotten themselves into a mess in Iraq, Jim. It has a lot to do with them just wanting to get totally involved in Iraqi politics and government and like that, and now they've sort of found themselves in a quagmire, right?
Well, they've been trapped, so to speak. Now, I don't know if this was on purpose or it's just something that was inevitable because they've been heading this way, for several years now. We reported in Strategy Page when a year or so ago when there started to be shootouts among the PMF. These are the militias that were started in 2014 to help stop ISIL. And Iran was in the middle of organizing the PMFs, and they tried to take control over as many of them as possible. In 2018, they managed to, the politicians managed to get the PMF not only put on the payroll, but made part of the army. Iran didn't like that too much. And they have basically, how should I put it, backed the formation or the organization of outlaw PMF units who take their pay but will not answer to the army. Now, this really came to a boil, as we put it, recently when there were several mysterious airstrikes. I think there were three, or at least three this month, in Iraq, which nobody took credit for. Actually, the Americans spilled the beans. That, one in particular was definitely the Israelis. Nobody is saying exactly how the Israelis did it, although one attack recently occurred in western Iraq, Anbar province, where a pro-Iran PMF brigade, or part of it anyway, convoy, was heading for the Syrian border to go into Syria to do what the Iraqi government expressly forbids, that is, fighting against the enemies of Iran in Syria. And when the smoke had cleared from this missile strike, two things were discovered. One was one of the people killed, and that might have been the target, was a senior PMF commander. Secondly, somebody got photos of the aircraft that launched the missiles, and it looks suspiciously like a UAV of the large type that can travel all the way from Israel to Iraq, or Iran for that matter. Israel said nothing. They usually do in cases like this. But the Iran is basically certain that the Israelis are behind this, and they are insisting that Iraq, the government, the parliament, order all American troops to leave. Now, currently, the Americans have about 5,000 troops and several thousand contractors in Iraq. The majority of Iraqis do not want the Americans to leave. Like the Europeans during the Cold War, they considered the Americans a tripwire, a way to keep the boogeyman out in the Cold War. It was the Russians, now it's the Iranians out of Iraq. The Iranians feel trapped by this because they're being made to look like fools, which is something the Iranians do not like. They're basically losing a lot of support by formerly, loyal PMF brigades, because, these PMF brigades are having leadership disputes where it comes down to the pro-Iraq leaders take over. They're not shooting at each other as much as they used to a few years back. But the Iraqi government pays lip service to backing Iran. But the reality is, and the Iranians are well aware of this, is that the Iraqis are basically turning against Iran. Now, this should come as no surprise. Again, as we have pointed out, during the 1980s war with Iran, most of the infantry, most of the troops, most of the casualties were Shia. And this upset the Iranians somewhat, but they didn't make a big deal of it during the war because, that wasn't supposed to happen. If it isn't part of the narrative, you just ignore it. They thought they had a big advantage after 2014 because of the way they basically, took credit for saving Iraq because the PMF brigades did play a large role in that. Of course, the Iranians didn't give the Kurds any credit. The Kurds were the people who really stopped the ISIL from advancing any further, because once they took Mosul, they were running into Kurdish forces, and these are the best trained Iraqi troops in Iraq. And they also have they always had American assistance, meaning American ground air controllers who could bring in American Army, Air Force or Naval air strikes using smart bombs. But the Iraqis noticed this. I mean, they realize, who their real friends, so to speak, are. And I think just this week, the United Arab Emirates went public with the support or the cooperation they've been having with the Israelis. Now, it was an open secret in the past. I mean, there were even meetings which were basically didn't happen, but a lot of people in the UAE knew, hey, those were Israelis. Those Arabs were Israelis that were meeting with, our military people. Well, now the Israelis have admitted that, yes, and the UAE did as well. Yes, we have been sharing intelligence information on mutual threats. Now, that could be interpreted as, ISIL, but it could also be interpreted, and it is correctly by Iraqis, as Iran. So Iran feels that it's push comes to shove time. They have to basically do something because they're slowly being squeezed out of Iraq. Now, they still have plenty of connections in Iraq. They even did during Saddam's time. The smugglers were, apolitical. They would buy and sell with anyone. So would Saddam during the 90s when he was under sanctions. Corruption makes allies of us all. But now, as Austin pointed out, the Iraqis resent the Iranians trying, in their usual sneaky Iranian Persian way, to grab control of the government. Now, on paper, or at least verbally, they have the ability to get Iraqi politicians to toe the party line, but that means nothing. It's just words, as the Iranians are finding out, because when push comes to shove, the Iraqi government will basically do what's best for Iraq, and that doesn't involve Iran. So the Iranians have been threatening to again go to war with American troops in Iraq. They haven't done it, in part because they have to use Iraqis to do it. And I think they're noticing that there's a big shortage of Iraqis who are willing to die fighting Americans in Iraq for Iran. Now, there are some, but, not enough. They're counting heads, and they keep coming up short, week by week. So something's going to go boom pretty soon, because the Iranians are running out of options. And now, if you were Machiavellian about this, you could say, and the Iranians like this point of view, that it's all a how should I put it, a Mossad scheme. They're scheming to turn our Shia, Arab allies against us. Well, they don't really have to, but the Israelis, by basically looking out for their own interests, not carrying out some nefarious conspiracy, we're hitting those PMF weapons depots because they basically contained high-tech weapons, anti-aircraft missiles, guided, rockets, GPS-guided rockets, and what have you, that the Iranians were bringing into Iraq. And what bothered the Iraqis was not that the Iranians were going to ship them off to Syria and Lebanon, which they have been doing, but that they were going to use them in some kind of civil war against the Iraqi government. So the Iraqis are certainly not going to do anything to actually stop the attacks on the Iranians. I mean, they issued orders, for example, that no aircraft can operate over Iraq without permission of the Iraqi government. Well, within 24 hours, there were conditions attached to that. Well, it doesn't affect American air support for Iraqi forces. Because we pointed out, if we have to go through, your bureaucracy before we can, protect your own troops and police, it ain't, it's going to be too late. And even the Iraqis can do the math on that. So they gave an exception. They technically gave an exception for Iranian air freight traveling through Iraq on their way to Syria, but the Iranians are getting a little nervous about that. In fact, they've stopped a lot of weapon shipments by air because the Israelis have launched some airstrikes on airports targeting Iranian freighters. Now, they have a limited number of 747 freighters, which basically belong to a Republican Guard, IRGC, controlled air transport company. There are, I think, two or three of those companies. And now the Iranians are basically planning on bringing in all their weapon shipments by boat. But now they're afraid the Israelis will do something about that as well. And the Americans, if you believe in conspiracy theories as much as the Iranians do, it can be a powerful weapon, because I notice the Americans and the West in general is getting much better at tracking, how should I put it, outlaw Iranian ships. They use also, we report on this regularly, the tricks the Iranians use, changing flags, turning off their locators and things like that, but still they get caught. It's whack-a-mole. I mean, you can't catch them all, but we're catching a lot more. So they feel the wall's closing in. Couldn't happen to nicer people.
Austin?
Yeah, let me make a comment about the increasingly good intelligence that the U.S. This applies to the Israelis as well, but I'm talking about shipping, commercial shipping at sea. The increasingly good intelligence the U.S. and its closest allies have applies to North Korea, definitely applies to Iran. And I've done as much as I can in looking at the open source data, open source information as to how this has come about. And I keep going back to a comment that Jim Mattis made when he was still Secretary of Defense about how their knowledge was improving of North Korean sanctions busting at sea, and he, as I recall, in the interview, there had been a North Korean freighter that had just been stopped by the U.S. Navy, and the Japanese had a couple of days earlier stopped another one, and there's inside human involved at some level. Someone is providing tips, but I think that there's a strong possibility that a lot of these suspect ships are being trailed by not just aerial reconnaissance, but drones, as well as being watched. And the drones or ships are electronic intelligence as well. And we've developed, as a result, profiles. Even if the ships have, like Jim said, shut off their transmitters, their geolocators, and the like, profiles of the kind of ships that the Iranians and North Koreans, any sanctions busting nation has. And once you've made an identification of that ship, the sea's a big place. The oceans are huge, but it's hard to hide a tanker. It's hard to hide even some of the coastal ships that the Iranians have used to ship weapons into Yemen. And it's, this is to the good of the United States and its allies. Now, again, Dan, What I've said is okay. There are reasons, and the reasons we've focused on this is that North Korean sanction busting was directed towards, well, not just keeping the regime in power, but building better ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. And the Iranian sanction busting ties back to, well, what was Jim describing the Iran's up to in Iraq? It's what Iran is up to in about 24 different places right now, violent meddling in other people's political systems. Iraq is Mesopotamia. The Iranians have been messing around in Mesopotamia, I guess I can say that, can't I, for about 3,500 years, maybe 4,000 years. They regard Mesopotamia, Iraq, as their property, or where their imperial lands. It should be their satrap. And of course, the Arabs who live there resent it. That gets back to what Jim said about even Shia Arabs who have a religious affinity with Iran, distrusting them. Because look back, this predates Islam. What the Iranians, Aryans, Persians have been doing to the Arabs in the area for at least 3,500 years. Now, to get back to the war that's going on inside Iraq right now, and it is a war. Evidence is, yes, the Israelis have gotten very good intelligence on what's going on in some of these popular militia force bases. They're preemptively, in my view, bombing them. Jim said, yeah, some of the weapons are in transit to Syria and Lebanon. Okay, that's preemptive bombing. And as a result, as Jim pointed out, they're doing Iraq a favor because some of these weapons depots could have been lagering weapons for a strike at the Iraqi government. Also point to an article that's up on Strategy Page now that Jim wrote. There's the U.S., after being accused by Iran of attacking some of these bases, pointed out that it's quite hot in Iraq right now. And having pulled a tour in Iraq myself, I'll guarantee you it's hot in Iraq all summer, but especially in July and August. And the militiamen are not competent when it comes to pulling daily maintenance, and they're not competent when it comes to storing explosives. And if there, as it points out in the article, if the explosives are being stored above ground, and typically they're stored in containers or in above ground metal buildings, if they're stored like that, they're going to get hot. So some of the detonations are likely. Some of the detonations are because of mishandling the explosives and the ammunition and storing it where it gets to 140, 150 degrees inside these buildings, and they blow up. Of course, the Iranians, as Jim said, they're into conspiracy theories. So that's got to be done by the Americans or the Israelis or even the Turks. Maybe the Kurds are doing it. No, their own guys are so poorly trained and so lazy, they just go and dump the ammunition and munitions above ground in these metal sheds. And again, that's up on Strategy Page. Go read it. I buy that, because I know it happens. It happens, and it happens when you don't take basic precautions handling the munitions like that. And that's another problem which the Iranians don't want to acknowledge, is that there's a certain kind of they want to be a world power, but they don't have the confidence to pull it off.
Another problem in Iraq is that the Iranians are accusing the Iraqis, perhaps truthfully, that how is it that these airstrikes are always hitting the concentrations, the stockpiles of the most valuable weapons. There are over 100 bases in Iraq that the PMF used. A lot of them are former American FOBs, forward operating bases,
Right.
which are basically small fortresses and what have you. A lot of containers were used for living quarters and what have you. Austin has personal experience with those.
No, but they do that, Jim, and
I know, but we had air conditioning, and they don't air condition their stored ammunition. But no, the point is that the Iranians are accusing the Iraqis. They don't basically want to believe that the Israelis have an informant network in Iraq, which is a more likely possibility because they sure as heck have an informant capability in Iran, as we found out in early 2018 when the Israelis basically looted half a ton of documents out of a secure facility in Tehran, the capital, and got it to Israel. That was a big embarrassment. But what irks the Iranians was that with all these places they could store these weapons, and many of them are stored, as Austin points out, in basically above ground, uncooled, as it were, places, which is bad for any kind of munitions, especially large munitions like rockets. And delicate munitions like these shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, but the problem is that the Israelis always seem to find them. And how are they doing that? The other problem they're having now is they are trying to transfer these weapons to different storage sites at night with convoys. And now it remains to be seen if the next airstrike will hit one of these new hiding places that they thought were secure, but they're hiding it. If that happens, then they've got to believe that there are not enough pro-Iraqi, pro-Iran Iraqis that are willing to keep their mouths shut. That people are basically picking up their cell phone and calling up a number that then again transfers them a certain amount of cash for valuable information on where the Iranians are storing their goodies. Now, this could be the Iraqi intelligence, most likely, or any number of other people, information brokers inside of Iraq. That's a fairly big business in Iraq or in the Middle East in general. But basically, the Iranians do not have operational security. That's what military calls, trying to keep local stuff secret. They cannot keep secrets. And if you can't keep secrets, you're in big trouble. And they basically want to get the Iraqis to crack down, and I don't think that's possible at this point. Iraqis are basically out of control as far as the Iranians have been concerned for hundreds of years. I mean, up until I think what was the 17th century, the Iranians controlled Mesopotamia. Then the Turks came in and took over, and that was the Dark Ages. Now that's 300 years of Sunni control of largely Shia Arab, Baghdad and southern Iraq. That's what basically created this extreme hatred for Saddam and between Shia and Sunni in Iraq. But the thing is, the Iranians are finding out they can't capitalize on this centuries of persecution, because basically what it comes down to is if the Iraqis have a choice, they'd rather be persecuted by other Arabs, whether they're Sunni or Shia, than Iranians. And right now, of course, the government in Iraq since 2003, since the Shia Arabs are an absolute majority in Iraq, Shia have been running the government. So the Arab Shia in Iraq cannot really complain that they're at the mercy of the Sunni Arab minority. Now their threat is over in Iran, and that's something the Iranians cannot unown. They own that. They cannot wash it away. They cannot add sweetener. It's a bitter tasting, situation that the Iraqi, Shia Arabs refuse to accept. And that is the problem, that basically they're being forced to try the most severe measures they can conjure up to resolve. And I don't think that's going to work. Austin's right. It may get very messy. We may have another, not exactly a civil war, but, strife, as it were. But that will be the end, so to speak, or of the pro-Iran PMFs, because if the Iranians basically trigger a civil conflict, we're win or lose. They basically lose a lot more of the support they do have. Now, that said, Iraq is a complicated place. There are factions within factions within factions, and even the Shia majority controlling the government has trouble, herding all their pro-Shia cats. But that the Iranians thought they could use to their advantage, but now it's basically turning out to be a disadvantage for them, because they're finding out that nobody can control the Shia Iraqis, and now they're turning the Shia Iraqis into sworn enemies, which is the last thing they want. But right now they feel, well, either we do it quick or we do it fast. I mean, do it quick or do it slow. Either with a frog who's going to get boiled quickly, or the water's just going to keep heating up until the frog is dead because he's been slowly boiled to death.
Let me make a comment about that Civil War scenario, Jim. If Iran triggers a civil war in Iraq, there is such a danger of triggering a civil war in Iran, especially in the Khuzestan, Arabistan, and some of the Persian Gulf littoral areas of Iran. It could spill over very easily, given the resentment of a number of Iranians against their own, the religious dictatorship. Now that is a scenario. It's speculation, but it's something. It's something that the rogue dictators need to take into consideration, which is the brittleness of their own regime, and a civil war in Iraq. Who's going to win it? It's not going to be pro-Iranian militias that will win that. Now, to get back on the intelligence, it's nice of the Iranians to tell the Israelis and the United States that the most important weapons depots are being targeted and being blown up. I'll take that with a grain of salt, but I'm going to just I'll say it's probably true. But where does the intelligence trail lead ultimately? It probably leads back to Iran, in the same way that we've gotten better intelligence about sea shipping, sanctions busting. And I said, remember, I mentioned that human intelligence, plays a critical role in keeping track of the sanctions of busting ships. It goes back to the port where it was loaded. And I would guess that the Israelis, Jim mentioned the Israelis have excellent intelligence inside Iran, that direct knowledge of what's in these weapons shipments is sent from sources inside Iran that either saw it loaded or had seen, knows what was going to happen. And that's where the tracking begins. You have to be very, very careful about that, because it's human intelligence. Some of it will be simply people because they're being paid for it, others because they're against the Iranian regime. But a lot of this isn't being strictly done by drones and observation, and I'm certain that the Iraqis provide intelligence to the U.S. and Israelis for a variety of reasons. But some of the intelligence on these shipments comes out of Iran, and that's if it makes the regime paranoid, so be it. That's one reason the Israelis are so good at hitting and identifying and hitting specific locations that have the rockets and surface-to-air missiles that are headed to Syria and Lebanon.
Well, I guess we'll watch and see if the explosions continue in Iraq mysteriously. Now, Jim, they did see they have seen aircraft in the area though when these have occurred. Some of them, right?
Yeah, and there were some cell phone photos of the UAV, the aircraft that fired the missiles at the convoy headed for the Syrian border. Now, one thing I'm unable to get more information about is when you fire a missile at a target. What we did, and what anybody can do, is collect all the missile fragments, and you can identify where it came from, if not from markings on some of the components, but simply from the design. For an airplane accident, you see the pictures later in a warehouse where they reconstructed the plane, as it were, from the pieces found. You can do the same sort of forensics with missiles or bombs. And I wonder, is that being done? Is anybody doing it? Now, it's not in the Iraqi government's interest to have these missile or smart bomb components identified as Israeli. Then again, the Israelis might make a special batch of their missiles that are scrubbed, as it were, of any national identification. I mean, they have laser-guided missiles. They use the Hellfire, or they have their own missiles like that. That's a mystery that has not much has been revealed on yet. That will be a story one of these days when enough hard information is collected. But you can get the evidence, and indeed the Iranians may have done it and said, well, let's keep this secret. And of course, another problem they have is it's still accepted in Iran that late last year, Israeli F-35s flew over Iranian cities, allegedly taking pictures or just showing the flag, as it were, and left without being detected by Iranian air defenses, which now include older S-300 systems from Russia, as well as various other, radars and what have you. And the head of the air defense system in Iran lost his job for that. Now, he may have lost it for other reasons, but the story on the street in Iran was the senior clerics, ayatollahs, are very upset about this because the ayatollahs, you basically made a lot of noise earlier in 2018 about the shabby state of the Iranian Air Force and air defenses, and this purported imaginary. Well, hey, if they believe it happened as far as they're concerned. That the Iranian F-35s were flying over Iran. That means several things. One, they had to refuel. They have permission to fly over, say, Saudi Arabia. Of course, Iraq doesn't have any any air defense system. And even if they did, would they basically identify somebody who's going to attack Iran? So Iran has a lot to worry about. Some of it imaginary, a lot more becoming real. Something else to remember, in 2011, the pro-Iran Shia militias tried to basically take power, like in Basra and a few other places, and they were put down. This is 2011. And for the same reason, there are more Iraqi soldiers, Iraqis with guns, willing to oppose with force if necessary pro-Iran Iraqis than the pro-Iran Iraqis could handle, and that basically was over in days. That particular uprising, those militias stood down, they kowtowed, they said, "Okay, we'll basically do what the government says." And the Iranians had a huge opportunity in 2014 to come in to rescue the Iranians by forming. With their weapons, they brought the weapons, they brought the advisors and what have you. They made the patriotic speeches. But now that's all slipping out of their fingers. So they're finding their so-called Iraqi Shia allies very fickle allies, which is great for us, great for Israel, great for Iraq, and not so good for Iran, which again, the government in there has been exposed to constant popular outbursts, demonstrations, calling literally for the downfall of the government, or even getting away from Islam, since late 2017. And of course now the Iran says they're willing to negotiate with the Americans, but first you got to lift the sanctions. Well, that's the last thing you want to do, because that economic pressure is what's basically bringing everything to a boil. You don't want to simmer when you can boil.
Give me money, then we'll talk. Yeah,
exactly.
That's right.
Cut me a little slack so we can rearm, and then we'll lie to you.
Okay, Dan, what
Yep.
Jim just did, bringing up the agitation within Iran, which began seriously in December 2017 and hasn't stopped. Oh, it goes into a lull, and then it comes back. That is one of the reasons I bring up, if you're going to incite, create a civil war in Iraq, watch for spillover into Iran. And the number of the towns where the agitation continues are in western Iran. It goes on in Tehran as well. And a number of those towns have had severe water problems, not really because of lack of water resources, but the local governments have not maintained their water supply systems. Money went for what? War in Syria and war in Yemen. At least that's what the Iranian people, the locals, think, and I think there's good reason to believe that. They've had to go to Iraq to buy water. Now that crisis kind of reached. At its worst point was maybe 8 or 9 months ago. It's been relieved a little bit since, but that's an angry population you've got inside Iran, angrier than you've got in Iraq right now. And the Iraqi anger is turned not to the Jordanians or even the Turks. It's at the Iranians.
Yeah, and the Iraqis are doing great. They had a record month in July for oil exports. They made $6 billion or something like that, which is more than they ever made before.
Better than 3 million barrels a day. And see, it was like 2.7, 2.8 millions a day in exports was regarded by the Iranians as that's a good number. Well, they're up now to like 3.1 or 3.2, and you said it was 110 million barrels.
For the month. Yeah.
All right, so that's right at 3.1 or 3.2 a day. So yeah.
Yep. And the Iranians feel, with some justification, that a lot of those sales are sales that should have been Iranian, but they're under sanctions and they can't ship as much as they'd like to.
Gee, that's real sad, Jim. That is so sad.
I mean, you got all those Iraqis playing the world's smallest violins.
Yeah, right. If you're going to go around and make war on everybody else, geez, things might come back and bite you. So.
That's right. Well, we'll continue to watch it, and it'll be interesting to see what else blows up in Iran-controlled Iraq. So we'll see.
Till next time.
Bye, guys. Bye.